Our second panel of this year's summit will look at how the changing landscape of ingredients, from current health trends, proposed bans, and recent acquisitions, is impacting how new food products show up in the market. Gavin Sachs, chair of the Cornell Cale's Food Science Department, will moderate this panel. Gavin will be joined by Ed Collins, director of Eurofin's Product Development and Innovation, Lane Clark, program manager for Big Idea Ventures, and Mark Nisbet, director of product development for Mars Snacking. Let's give them a warm welcome to the stage.
Fantastic. Thank you to the organizers for inviting us to speak here today on ingredients. I'm in a food science department. I am chair and professor, Gavin Sachs, of the Department of Food Science at Cornell University, so ingredients are never boring to us. But over the last few years, and definitely over the last year, I think ingredients have gotten a lot more exciting and interesting for both good and maybe not so good reasons. So we're going to talk today about two parts. As Kathy mentioned, some of this is going to be about challenges. It's going to be about restrictions and the possibility of overcoming those restrictions with alternatives in response to proposed and enacted bans. It's also going to be about innovations, new opportunities in the food space, both for CPGs and for innovators with technology. So next I'm going to have our panel introduce themselves before we move on to discussion. Ed?
I'm Ed Collins. I'm the Director of Product and Process Innovation for Eurofins. We do ingredient technology, assessments, new product development across the food, beverage, and supplement industries.
I'm Lane Clark. I'm with Big Idea Ventures, and Big Idea is a global investment fund that focuses on agri-food and food tech and materials sciences. I've also been with the Good Food Institute previously for about 4 years, and I'm an entrepreneur in residence for Georgetown University for about the last 8 years.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Nisbet. I'm the Director of Product Development for Mars Wrigley. My team is responsible for developing new products for our global brands like Snickers, M&M's, Skittles, Extra Chewing Gum. So we work on both innovation and renovating our portfolio to meet regulations, changing consumer landscape, and things like that. So really excited to be here, really inspired by all the pitches yesterday. So it's great to be here.
Great, thank you. A little bit about the format. I'm going to lead a conversation, but towards the end, we're going to have about 5 minutes to entertain questions from the audience. And I'm going to make the first question relevant to the last thing that you said, changing consumer landscape. And this is both due to consumer interest, but also due to the changing regulatory landscape. A lot of the focus on ingredient restrictions, proposed and enacted bans, have been about things like artificial food dyes, things that perhaps if you have a new startup, you are less concerned about. You weren't planning on putting that into your food or have your technology make that anyway. So what should newer startups think about these proposed and enacted bans going forward? Is it relevant to them at all? What concerns are there?
Well, I think there's a couple things going on, right? So there's the whole MAHA conversation, obviously the immediate ones and things that will impact Mark and a lot of the kind of historic brands are changes in the food colors. Those are actually being driven a lot by the states. So it's not very often you see West Virginia, Texas, and California all agree on like we should do something about food ingredients, but they pick colors, right? So a lot of it will be driven by what the states decide to do. Long-term, California is looking at what their definitions will be for ultra-processed and what they'll regulate. I mean, those are things that people have to look at school lunches 10 years out. So not all of them are tomorrow, but the colors are certainly one that are pressing and will start soon.
Good. Lane?
Yeah, I mean, I think for startups especially, it's important to look at what the future potential is for these kinds of ingredient concerns. I look at cultivated meat, for instance, and we've got bans in 7 states right now in the US. We have Italy having banned it completely, France and Austria are considering it. So this comes to play in terms of getting investment, because VCs are going to be a little bit squeamish about something that might be banned completely. So I think you have to think about the potential for this happening and work around it if you can. And then the other part is just to not be afraid to dive in and really advocate for whatever it is that you're trying to get through. I think that your voices matter.
Yeah, I think that last piece about advocating for what you're trying to do, because I saw yesterday a lot of really exciting startups that plant cell fermentation, these sorts of things. This will still be new technology, just kind of like the cultured meat space. And I think advocating for the benefits and being able to have a conversation with the regulators, being able to explain to your consumers the advantages, whether that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions or developing a healthier alternative. Like, there are benefits to these technologies, and I think making sure you can have that conversation with those key parties like regulators.
Okay, very good. So to continue on current topics and current buzzwords, ultra-processed foods. It's right up there with ingredient bans. Again, is this something that as a small startup needs to be something that you consider? Should you be worried about whether or not your food is considered ultra-processed or an ingredient in your food is considered ultra-processed?
It's obviously going to grow, right? I mean, we were talking in the back that you mentioned that whiskey is now an ultra-processed food.
Yeah,
so
I tuned out as soon as I heard that.
Tuned out.
So, yeah.
Salami is another one that falls in that category, those types of fermented meats. I think most people, and we had talked about, like, however many years ago when Whole Foods kicked off with here's the Whole Foods list. Lane has some things to say about that, but there's some things there where there's people have already started moving that way, right? So are all ultra-processed foods bad for you? No. Those are things like the state of California has put a whole bunch of definitions in as far as what ingredients go into them. There's you can't use modified food starch, which is what I used to make for a living. There are things like that are in that'll grow, but really most people are focusing on clean products long term, and so the majority of what people make probably don't fall into that. And there's the self-affirmed grass that we'll talk about at some point, and you can probably address that a little bit with.
Yeah, I'll just go back to sort of the story of ultra-processed. This started out in South America, and one person came up with the kind of definition of it. It's gotten a little muddied. Not everybody agrees on it. And when you go to the consumer landscape, consumers really don't have the time or the interest in really delving into it. So all they hear is ultra-processed, and that's the end of that. So I think the main goal here is to stay as clean as possible and be as transparent as possible. But we have to think, too, about educating consumers, because we have, like, precision fermentation coming down the pike, which is going to potentially offer amazing solutions, groundbreaking solutions that will solve real problems. And yet you have huge chains like Whole Foods saying we don't need anything that's GMO, which by nature precision fermentation is. So we have to get out there and figure out how to educate the consumers to understand and not be afraid of the science that we're all working on to improve the planet. And it's not an easy job. It's going to take a lot of people working together to help it happen.
Oh, Lane, could I do a quick follow-up to that? So you mentioned there's multiple ways of thinking about ultra-processed. We have an original classification system that was based on the extent of processing. Then we have other classifications, and this is the way California is approaching it, which are based more on ingredients. From what you see, what do most consumers think? Do they make that distinction? Do they have any idea?
I think one of the best consumer campaigns, one of my favorites, was when Breyers had the little kids trying to pronounce the words on the label. And I think basically consumers just want to look down and see Whole Foods that they recognize, that they're comfortable feeding their families. And so we have to figure out how to get around that, because if we're going to use some of these processes, we can't just be as straightforward. We have to be transparent, and especially when you get into fermentation, because and some of the other solutions that are out there, because especially with allergens, you get into some very tricky territory. So we have to be transparent, and we have to educate. We have to say what we're doing, and yet consumers completely don't have the capacity. I'm not saying they're not smart enough, they just don't have the time to make this their focus. They want to just go to the grocery store, see something, say, okay, this looks clean, I'm going to take it home.
Okay, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of this. I think anytime you have to educate the consumer as a brand, it's a really difficult place to be in. And so what's the right way to share the message? Who's the right partners? And I think coming here, I mean, that's one of the reasons I like to be on the advisory council of Cornell, because I think there's a partnership between regulators, academics, and brands to help triangulate the messaging for consumers, because I think everyone in this food system plays a role in helping to define and educate each other, really, because I think we're all trying to figure this out. Like, even we're all consumers, and we all make decisions on what we want to buy. But I do think we have big challenges ahead of us, and to meet these big sustainability goals and make our food supply safe and affordable, there's going to be choices like how do we upcycle our waste streams and things like that, and that's additional processing. So technically, that would be ultra processed foods.
And when you were mentioning the different categories, how they categorize things, whatever the right word for that is. That some of the definitions even include ingredients of no culinary use, limited or no culinary use, right? So things like flavors and things like that, which are very common in the industry, actually get you into that. And you can already see them backing off of some of those approaches and how they look at the definition. But it was pretty broad to begin.
Okay, thank you. And as you can tell, my primary concern is how bourbon whiskey is going to be categorized at the end of all of this. So we started off with some of the challenges regarding restrictions, but I want to open this up to also talk about potential innovations or opportunities. So every year we get to go to trade shows, we see new hot ingredient trends. Do you want to make some predictions about what things that are trends right now that are going to be more than that are going to be something lasting, where they just become every day in new and emerging consumer packaged goods?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lane already mentioned it, but precision fermentation, plant cell fermentation, I think finding alternative ways to produce the key proteins or aroma molecules that we need in our food system will be a lasting trend. I mean, at Mars, we've partnered with Perfect Day. We launched Coca-Cola, which was a fermented dairy-like protein in our milk chocolate. So I think we'll continue to do this as we look for new solutions to make food more efficient, reduce carbon footprint, et cetera.
Lane?
Yeah, I'm really interested in the chocolate space because it's just not sustainable long term to continue with traditional chocolate making. So I think we're seeing some really amazing innovation come out. Some using alternative to traditional, and some making changes to the traditional way of processing. But I'm very encouraged by this.
Ed,
Yeah.
what do you think is going to be coming? That's a trend now that's going to be sticking around.
I mean, obviously protein is everywhere, right? How can you get some of the fermented protein? People are looking all across the spectrum, right? So sorry, I've forgotten the young man's name, but we were talking with, they're putting mushroom farms in, right? With dairies, there's a source of nutrients, right? So where are you going to refine? What are you going to refine from that? How are you going to get to it? And I think those new sources will continue to grow, right? We've talked about precision fermentation. How are those going to be categorized? The hurdle that maybe it's GMO, they're not going to go everywhere. What's your recovery? So I think those will continue to go. And then we had another conversation about the practicality and being able to do these. So I think folks need to look at that realistically, like how much can you actually produce and at what scale as you move into some of these new ingredient types.
Yeah, okay, so that's one of the challenges with new ingredients is can you find, or even existing ingredients, is there a supply, and is that supply going to continue? You mentioned cacao, and definitely natural food dyes is an ongoing concern. But with respect to new ingredients, the word grass came up before, and we also were discussing backstage that there's some new changes likely to be made to what constitutes something that is grass. So, but before, so I'm not sure where all the audience is on this Mark, can I pick on you to talk about what the GRAS landscape is, what it means, and how that might be changing?
Yeah, so GRAS refers to generally recognized as safe, and in the United States, the process has been to, as long as there's no evidence that the ingredient would cause harm, usually you can put a GRAS dossier together and get that approved by the FDA. I think we have new proposals that are being legislated around changing that definition and how we might change the burden of proof to having to prove it's safe rather than prove that there's a harm to it, and more similar to the European model. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because as we get novel ingredients from precision fermentation or other methods of recovering waste streams and things like that, I think the burden of proof on how safe these new ingredients are will be something that slows down maybe the adoption, the implementation. I think the regulatory hurdles will be an important consideration for a startup to think about how they're going to scale and how they're going to get their ingredients into the marketplace.
Good. So we've been focusing mostly on the national landscape, US landscape, but there's also international regulations to consider. But if you're a new startup and your focus is right now just growing to sell locally or regionally, do you need to be thinking about the international regulatory landscape? When should you start thinking about this?
Well, my rule of thumb is that you, from the very beginning, think long and hard about who you want to be. So if you feel like you're going to eventually want to go into another region, let's say that you're going to start in the US and then go to Europe, then yes, you should be thinking very clearly about what's going on with your potential for being able to do that from a regulatory standpoint. And so many startups have, big dreams, but then they don't think through it enough in the beginning, and they're not prepared. This is something that you have to start preparing for long before you're ready to do it. And I also just wanted to mention, don't be afraid to make relationships, to build relationships, both in Europe and the US, with the regulatory bodies. So the FDA very much welcomes any inquiries. It's good to get on their sort of radar early. So whether you're dealing with, Europe or another region or US, just don't be afraid to get out there and start really thinking through extremely early. It's never too early.
Yeah. Mark, you're part of a large CPG that does acquisitions of smaller companies. That's often the exit strategy for these small startups. Do you run into issues ever where people have not thought about the regulatory landscape either in the US or outside of the US?
Given that that's part of like the vetting process that we would do, I think we would be looking at the regulatory compliance of any potential acquisitions. But I think there is, as we incorporate acquisitions like True Fruit is a great example where we've brought them into Mars Wrigley recently. If you haven't tried that product, it's great. These are like chocolate-covered strawberries, and they're delicious. Find them at Target. But as we bring them in, there's not just the regulatory hurdles, but also our food safety and quality standards and things like this. So there's a whole range of maybe additional vetting or standards that we might have internally at Mars that a startup might not be on the same page, and we have to navigate that together. But oftentimes, regulatory would be kind of the bare minimum, like making sure they're regulatory compliant before we entertain acquisition.
They're going way back to 18 years ago when Mark and I worked together. There are certain ingredients, and Laney mentioned it, where you're talking about self-affirmed GRAS, right? So how it gets in. There's a lot of smaller companies that will move quickly, like stevia would be a classic example. It started in a supplement, and then it kind of weaves its way through, and then it gets to Truvia, and kind of builds from there. But we were doing research on sweetener systems for a giant CPG, and they're like, no, we won't touch it because it's self-affirmed GRAS, right? So there are some companies that will look at those and take a step back based on whatever their corporate culture is and how they approve things. So as you look at some of those ingredients, particularly if you're going to Europe where it's a whole different ball game, it is important to keep an eye on it.
Okay, yeah, and it sounds like although no change has been made yet at the federal level regarding self-affirmed GRAS, there is an expectation from Health and Human Services that they're going to review and then eventually phase out self-affirmed grass in 2026. What comes next is still an open question after that, but it's almost certainly going to become more challenging to have grass approval for your new ingredients.
Certainly. I mean, they're going to go back. One of the bills even has, I think it's 10 ingredients that they want to go back and look at right away. So like in California, where there's the list of everything that goes in ultra-processed, there's also like BHA or BHT, things like that people use every day. You know, you see more rosemary extract and all sorts of natural antioxidants that people are moving to anyway. But, you know, go back and say, are these actually safe? Are they, you know, fit for purpose, I guess you would say, and start looking at whether all those ingredients should be in. And, you know, there's 10,000 or something like that food ingredients in the U.S., and there's 300 or 400 in the EU, right? And part of it is just how you have to get the market. So you'll see changes in how that'll impact it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we were making reference to this, but if you're a new startup, this sounds like something that you should be concerned about as you are building up your product and thinking about next steps. So with respect to ingredients or ingredient technology, what mistakes do you see early startups making when that's going to affect, say, the interest of a larger company or consumers when they're thinking about either purchasing the product or acquiring the company?
I'll speak to the startup end of things. I think in this room, especially, in this sector especially, we have a lot of brilliant scientists who are working on groundbreaking technologies, and it's very easy to fall in love with the potential of that. It's very easy to say, like, wow, this is so incredible that we unlocked X, Y, or Z. But this has got to be a business, and speaking from an investor standpoint, you have to be able to go out there and prove that there is a customer that's willing to pay, that you can scale, and that you can deal with the low margins of food and still be profitable. So I think thinking about that really, really early is your path to success versus spending too much time falling in love with what you've discovered. Once you've proven that you can do it, then you need to move on to get somebody with true business acumen in the room and figure out how to get your customers lined up.
Okay, very good. Ed, you work with you and your company work with people throughout the spectrum. You work with early stage companies. You work with much more mature companies. What mistakes do you see, or put another way, what ways can these newer companies set themselves up for success when thinking about ingredients?
Right. So it builds on what Lane just said, right? So what problem are you gonna solve, right? It's Seth from Skull and Diamond, I think, was sitting at our table this morning. We were eating breakfast, and it's talking about, all right, how are we going to reach out to our customers? What are we going to do with this ingredient? What's it going to fix for them? And then how do we communicate or present that to them? Is it, you know, here's a study we ran. What are the things you can share that addresses a pain point or a need for that client that will drive them to then, you know, try your ingredient or buy your product or implement that solution. So it's having a focus on that and like what you'll actually use that ingredient for at the end of the day and what it'll solve, not just like, hey, I made this really cool thing. It's like really hard to make, but you know, who's gonna use it?
Mark, when companies start small and they are planning to get acquired and get much bigger, do you see mistakes that they make or things that you then have to address at your level that would have been better to address early on?
Well, I think, you know, if we go to the first more on the ingredient side, you know, we've screened a lot of really unique ingredients. Like when we talk about sweet proteins or, you know, novel sweet proteins or things like that, they're very, like the potential is clear and, you know, the taste profile, everything's great. But I think where maybe they have overlooked is if this is truly a novel protein, getting the GRAS status, you know, making it generally recognized safe, they started building that dossier. Do they have a timeline for regulatory approval? Because we might not, you know, we would not, as Mars Wrigley, just put that in a product right away. We'd need that sort of approval. And then the second thing is scale. I think, it'd be great to partner with a company like Mars Wrigley, but we might need, put it in a chewing gum application, supply of 100 tons of product, like this is, scale is often one of the things that the view to get to the scale that we might need for a supplier to be in one of our core products is pretty large. And so having that coming with the plan of how to get from where we are today to where we would need to be to incorporate into our core products is something that I think has been a bit of a stumbling block.
Yeah. So making sure, and we saw supply chain issues for large companies, but again, I suppose the other side of it is also when you're small and it's easy to source things, as you start scaling up and suddenly you have new supply chain issues that you weren't recognizing. Okay, so when you work with startups, and I'll put this back to Lane since you work with many startups, you talked about the value proposition side. Are there things, and the importance of having a good business plan and for potential investors, are there things or items that you see new startups valuing, thinking are important, that really aren't going to be very valued by consumers?
Yeah, I mean, I think sorry about my voice. Sorry, okay. I think that in general, startups will look at what they're doing and fall in love with their mission, just very similar to what I was just talking about. And they're looking maybe at the sustainability of it, at what problems it solves in the world. They're excited, and they feel like everybody else is going to see that too. And the issue comes in when they're overvaluing that. So they're thinking like, because I can walk into a room and prove that this is going to solve so many problems for people on the planet, that the investors are going to go, oh great, let me write a check. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, not only investors but also larger corporations, they have financial mandates. This is business. And so you're not going to be able to be a charity project. And so you've got to be able to look past all of those wonderful things. And sometimes that might mean that when you're presenting or pitching, you're not emphasizing that quite as much because you have to understand your audience very well. And I'll just give you an example of not working with a business, but somebody that I just worked with that got a very large grant. And they were really smart because they went in thinking that they would go about it by using sustainability as the carrot. And instead, they started talking about how we were going to be able to move manufacturing to non-oppositional countries. And that non-oppositional country feature is what ended up getting them the money. Keep it domestic, keep it at home. Now, they didn't start this company because of that, but that's what got them this very large grant. And sometimes that's what gets people partnerships, looking at creative ways to talk about their venture. So that was a long-winded answer, but it's super important to remember those.
Yeah, Ed, what do you see?
No, I was going to ask about the non-oppositional country.
Oh, please.
And where that definition came from. Like, it's not a phrase I've heard before, but I get it. Yeah.
It's a political phrase. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
So thanks, Lane. I mean, to summarize, even if for you as the new startup company, you put a lot of value on something like reducing CO2 emissions, which is important, that may not be valued as much by potential investors or consumers. They're going to have other criteria when they're evaluating your product. Ed, what do you see from your end?
Right. So when you see like upcycling, for example, is a huge trend, right? Everybody's looking at it. Renewal Mills, I think, had some upcycled ingredients out of soy that they're showcasing downstairs. But even like the big CPGs, they'll look at what are the waste streams, how can they call it valorization, right? So how can we create value out of this waste stream? What things can I get out of my orange peels or whatever's left of cocoa after you make, like what's the fiber, what's the,
You've never seen valorization? And so the example I always give is cocoa butter was originally a waste product. And people wanted the cocoa powder to make hot chocolate with. And then finally somebody realized you could do something with that cocoa butter, which is make some delicious chocolate for now. Yeah. So what is the problem then that you see on the valorization or upcycling side?
Even at that scale, there's some of what can you actually get out of it, right? So we have enough citrus fiber, right? So is Minute Maid or Tropicana going to recycle it, or is somebody already doing that? And then what are the trace materials that are in there, right? So even with, there are some products that there are additional ingredients that you can get out of them, but is it just we're doing it to do it, and it's not creating any value or saving any money beyond being kind of neat to do?
Very good. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think sustainability is something that we see consumers expecting companies to have a sustainability story and be actively working on sustainability projects, but we're not seeing that as a reason to pay more. So they expect M&Ms to be talking about switching to compostable packaging, but they don't want that to cost any more than the plastic packaging that we use, and they still want to have the same properties. I don't know if everybody follows this, but we had a bit of an issue at Halloween a year ago with a rainy Halloween with compostable packaging in M&Ms. So they still expect it to work just as well as the control product, costs the same amount, but they still want us to be working in these sustainable areas. So
okay, very good. We're at the point now in this conversation where we want to give the audience an opportunity to pose questions to our panelists. We have 2 microphones, I believe on either side. Those will not come to you. I don't believe you have to come to the microphone. So I'm going to invite at this time, if you have a question, please come up to the microphone and you can pose your question. Okay, I see people walking, although I don't know if that's to get more pastry and coffee or otherwise. So yeah, please.
Howdy, my name's Matthew Morris. I'm an MBA at Cornell. Thank you guys for your time. One ingredient that we've been looking at, asking a lot of questions now that I've become a dad, is seed oil. I just pulled up a New York Times article that was published 2 months ago, and the 5 leading baby formulas that are on the market right now, the number 3 ingredient is rapeseed oil. Regardless of where you stand, it's known that this leads to obesity and health problems, especially in children. Is there any work that's being done to find an alternative that can go into baby formulas so that when my wife gives birth to our son in May, we have a safe alternative?
So infant formula is a tough one, right? So the path to get to infant formula is very long, it's very expensive, there's limited capacity, so there's a lot of barriers to innovation in that space, right? So you've got to do the rat studies, you have to do the feeding studies with infants, like all these things take time. There are companies starting to look at what are the other oils that you can use in those formulations. So that's actually an active conversation about how you get away from those. I don't know what the timeline for that'll be, but they are looking at that today.
Excellent.
Yeah.
There are also a couple of companies out there who are working on, it's kind of in the all proteins sector, who are working on infant formula that would be derived from, say, precision fermentation. It wouldn't require seed oils. Some of them are, I won't say very far along, but far enough along that I expect that they will be able to get to a product and get to market distribution.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I would say
Congratulations.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully there'll be some.
Cornell class of 2048, I think.
We'll save a space for him in one of the dorms. Yeah, it is an interesting question because that is a place where there's 2 ways to talk about this. From the ingredient side, you can talk about the source. Is it coming from a seed? Or do you talk about it chemically? What are the types of fatty acids that are present? A lot of the health studies focus on what are the specific types of fatty acids. There are seeds like flaxseed, for example, that have a healthier range of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. But to a consumer, seed oil is what sticks with you, and that's what you're going to see on the packaging. Good. And so, do we have any questions? Thank you. Yeah, please.
Hey, Gavin. Really nice to see everybody thoroughly enjoyed this panel. I thought it was great. Julie Suarez worked for Cornell, so a little bit implicitly biased or explicitly biased towards Cornell science. I have a question about food dyes because it didn't come up. And so one of the things that I am fascinated by is, New York, we're now #1 in table beets. Why? Because we're selling a lot of beets to love beets, but we're also selling a lot of beets for red food dye replacement. So just kind of curious from a manufacturing perspective, and this is kind of more for Mars and for Mark, but how are you going to handle this massive supply shift in kind of a limited space of time when we think about how long it takes growers to adopt to giving you the natural food ingredients you need?
Yeah. Start putting more beets in the ground right now, I think is part of it. I mean, that's a joke, but it's really, that's one of the things we're up against. So when you think about M&Ms and Skittles, I mean, the vibrant colors are what we're known for. Taste the rainbow is our tagline. So it's a reality that we're dealing with, but it's not necessarily the technical solution. We have natural dyes that work well that we are, I've got my team running a trial today, actually doing some work on this, but it's the supply chain that is limiting. So there are not enough, especially when you get into the blues and greens, there's not enough volume. We make 200,000 tons of M&Ms a year, and so that's a lot of food dye that's required for that. So I think putting more beets in the ground is really part of the strategy, or growing more algae spirulina extraction. There's infrastructure that's needed for that.
And those companies are growing them in both hemispheres, right?
Yeah.
So while we're sitting here not growing anything right now in upstate New York, somebody's growing it down in Brazil or somewhere else as we speak. So they'll grow in both seasons.
Okay, well, thank you. In just a moment, I'm going to thank our panelists, but first, an important announcement. We're going to resume in a few moments for the next block of pitches. And now I'd like to thank Mark, Lane, Ed. Thank you for joining this panel for discussion of ingredients.